We are so glad you're joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, the first Lunch and Learn of 2021, protecting 30% of America's land and waters by 2030. Next slide. We are joined today by Dr. Lindsay Rosa, who is the Senior Conservation Scientist at Defenders of Wildlife. Dr. Rosa is going to discuss the effort to help address biodiversity and the climate crises by protecting at least 30% of Earth's terrestrial and marine systems by 2030. And we'll also explore how Maine can help answer the call for greater biodiversity, conservation, and climate mitigation. Next slide. My name is Kathleen Neal. I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations work to protect Maine's environment and our democracy by building diverse coalitions, influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Next slide. A few technical notes for today's event. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. You can send your questions to me, Kathleen, through the chat as they occur to you. I will keep track of them and we'll ask those questions during the Q&A session at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message Will Sedlak through the chat function for help. And again, you can find that chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. This event is being recorded. It's also being broadcast live on YouTube, which is a new thing for us. We will send a link out this afternoon and post that link on our website, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thanks again for joining us. And Lindsay, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Let's see. And I'll just have you all tell me when you are able to view. Seems to be thinking. How about now? Does that seem to be working?
Looks great, Lindsay.
In presentation view and everything?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me today. I am Lindsay Rosa, as was mentioned, and I'll be talking a little bit today about 30 by 30, which may be familiar. Maybe some of you are becoming even more familiar with it day by day, as it's kind of one of the very big and exciting newer initiatives in the conservation space. I'm with Defenders of Wildlife, and I'm housed in our Center for Conservation Innovation, where we integrate science, technology, and policy to advance conservation of wildlife. That means really, a number of things that are coming together to carry out research, developing new tools, imagining new policies, and more. As Senior Conservation Scientist, I lead CCI's science team to ensure that Defenders' science needs are met, and that we are leading the way in cutting edge science for conservation. Our current work on 30 by 30 is a prime example of our center leveraging kind of the expertise of our own staff and of our growing network to kind of fill gaps and inform decision making. And so you'll hear 30 by 30 a lot in these next 30 to 40-ish minutes. And what is that? So it's been this call to action, really a science-driven one, to protect at least 30% of our lands and seas on Earth by 2030. And this call is really in response to our current crises for biodiversity and climate change. So I'll go a little bit deeper into that. Otherwise, I could just, I guess, end the talk now. And then I'll go into some of the science that we've been doing at the center in Defenders of Wildlife to explore more about 30 by 30 and what that means for the US. And then I'll give you kind of a sneak peek into some of the other work that we're doing and what some of these things may mean for the state of Maine, which holds a very special place in my heart. My expertise on the science team at Defenders is in geospatial analyses, GIS and mapping. And as a undergrad at Colby College, that is where I got my first experiences in GIS. And so now really putting them to work. So as some of you may know, we're on the brink of the sixth mass extinction with overwhelming scientific evidence demonstrating exceptionally rapid loss of biodiversity over the last few centuries, and it's only expected to continue unless action is taken. The international conservation community points to potential pathways for slowing or reversing declines in biodiversity, but these options require transformative changes across economic, social, political, and technological factors. Among the strategies considered essential to restoration and maintenance for quality habitat is through a more extensive global protected areas network. So one science-based recommendation is protecting at least 30% of Earth's terrestrial and marine systems by 2030. And that's a goal that's been embraced as 30 by 30 and really as kind of a stepping stone almost to 50 by 50, which is another goal that the global international conservation community is exploring and discussing. So such protections should be targeted to achieve maximum benefits to biodiversity, conservation, and climate mitigation. Those are kind of the key tenets. Among other things that are being explored as part of as part of 30 by 30, like equity and access to nature, which are all wonderful things coming together in these 30 by 30 policies and proposals. The first step in operationalizing 30 by 30 in the US will be identifying areas of the country that serve as really potential targets for new protected areas given all of these different goals. There's been a lot of support and excitement over 30 by 30, as you can imagine, especially from the conservation communities. There's a lot of messaging and coalition building that's going on. Some of the major players, being in these major campaigns from the global community to ones in the US, where I think the American Nature Campaign is driven by the Center for American Progress and is signed on by well over 180 different environmental NGOs at this point, including Defenders. And there is growing support from policymakers in the US, which is what is making this ever more exciting. Some of these faces may be more familiar to you now than they used to be. So 30 by 30 bills were co-sponsored by our now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris and the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. And it was part of the Biden-Sanders Unity Strategy and more. It's now actually been enacted in an executive order in the state of California, and more states are taking a look at this, including yours. So what do we actually know about protections and where we are in reaching this 30% in the US? As the messaging and kind of support of this movement has continued to gain momentum, Defenders started asking a lot of questions and really was recognizing this kind of true lack in a data-driven understanding of 30 by 30 in the US specifically. Resolutions in the House and Senate claimed that 12% of terrestrial and 26% of marine territories were already protected. And of course, we wanted to know where those numbers came from. But more importantly, we realized that these numbers were not going to help many decision makers working at state, regional, or local scales to operationalize 30 by 30. Mostly because it's safe to say that these are not static numbers. They're going to change with scale and across the country, depending on where you're living and where you're working in. So this information that and analyses that we did, we were really hoping this would be important for exploring and the possible pathways to improving land protections for biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation under 30 by 30. In our recent report, Getting to 30 by 30, we conducted a national level analysis combining protected areas, biodiversity, and ecosystem carbon data to identify broad policy needs for pursuing 30 by 30 in the US. We worked with the protected areas database, which you can see here, to look at those areas that are managed consistently with biodiversity conservation in the green, and those that are managed for more multiple use and really have varied priorities in the yellow there. And you can see how that kind of plays out on the ground in real time. So those areas that they're managed for conservation are this gap 1 area on the left-hand side. Those that are managed for multiple use are gap 3, which you can see on the upper right, and then gap 4. These are essentially just codes that are given, means that there's no known protections there at all. So it's pretty stark and pretty amazing how those really play up to their designations there. We compared the protected areas network to these main data sets. One on the upper left is on species richness and biodiversity, and that's for imperiled species. And that includes over 2,200 species distribution models that go into that one. And then on the right-hand side, one that's representing carbon sequestration potential based on USGS's land carbon data. And so here's where all of the states kind of shake out. Currently, Alaska is the only state to reach 30%, given the definition of those codes and what is, essentially being managed for conservation. And we were also curious to see what would be essentially, the maximum protection we could achieve given the entire protected areas database. So what if we added in those areas that are currently being managed for multiple use? And you'll see that we could actually achieve 30% in a few more states there. 12 to be exact. 11 of those actually could do so by focusing solely on federal lands. So federal agencies actually manage over 85% of the entire protected areas network. So we're realizing that federal action is definitely going to be an important part of moving toward 30% target, especially in these states. It's also very apparent that an even larger number of states still don't come anywhere close to that 30% line. And that means that not all paths to 30% will really be equal. You can see, obviously, Maine here is one of those states. And so it's just going to be a very kind of tailored pathway, depending on where you're talking about in the country for achieving 30%. We also found that actually of the biodiversity hotspots, those really biodiverse rich areas, 80% of those were in areas that were completely without protections. So this legend here in the lower left-hand corner is kind of showing you that with those protections, stronger protections being in blue areas and areas with more imperiled species in these yellow and orange areas. So if those actually overlapped, you would hope to see more of these greens, which unfortunately we don't on this map. We'd like to see more greens. It would indicate that protected areas are indeed protecting locations significant for biodiversity richness. but obviously there's some work to do, particularly in Appalachia, up into New England a bit, in parts of California and others. So action will need to go beyond federal in order to protect 30% in a way that's actually meaningful to addressing biodiversity crisis. We also took a look at that in terms of carbon, and you'll see there's a lot of similar patterns, a lot of, or very few places in green, so very little overlap still. So again, still a lot to be done in terms of protecting areas that are going to be meaningful for both biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation. So that could be supporting current farm bill programs and other programs that are going to be for private lands conservation and increasing incentives for easements. These were kind of some of the main takeaways. I will encourage you to explore the full report. We do go into detail on a few other things. We do cover oceans a bit. We look at not just the very basic species richness, but also a rarity weighted richness. So for those species that have very small ranges. And we take into consideration some of these other main tenets of 30 by 30, including equitable access to nature. So federal action is essential, basically because there is so much of our protected areas network that's managed by federal agencies. But in order to essentially expand our protected areas network in a way that's going to be meaningful for achieving those main purposes of 30 by 30, the addressing both the biodiversity and climate crises, it'll need to go outside that federal lands network. There's going to need to be tailored approaches again, because there's so many different things at play depending on where you're looking at in the country. If you want to get, again, the details on the marine, there's kind of a similar pattern to be shown. There are, great places being protected by federal seas, but still there's going to be a lot of need for filling in those gaps, and state protected areas, state marine protected areas may be one of those options. So what's next? Here's this is going to be kind of like an inside look into some of our next projects that'll be available fairly soon. Obviously, this is really where we start to dive into some of those takeaways that we had from our initial report. As you can imagine, there's so much more that can be explored in 30 by 30 space. So really our projects the number of projects on our plate has kind of snowballed, just because there's so many great questions out there still yet to be answered. Obviously, one of those major takeaways that we dove into was the federal lands piece. So areas protected for biodiversity in the US are largely reliant on federal policy, which is why this map, which is our federal lands estate, looks very similar to that protected areas map. So of course, we're interested in what can be done in working with these agencies to further the 30 by 30 goals. While these lands may not be the most biodiverse relative to the nation, or some of our other projects continue to really show that they still host many of the federally listed species. And those are species listed under the Endangered Species Act, which is what a lot of defenders' work is focused on. The federal land management agencies are obligated under the Endangered Species Act to contribute to the recovery of these species and help move them off the endangered species list. Unfortunately, agencies are largely kind of failing this charge, and that's because there are, a lot of obstacles in place, including kind of limited resources and funding. These problems, though, must be solved if the US has any hope in stemming the extinction crisis, and adopting 30 by 30 may be one way to help to support these agencies in moving forward with those charges. And so we hope to help begin discussions on how to operationalize 30 by 30. by one, kind of identifying current well-protected strongholds where defenders and other conservation groups can continue support conservation action, and also identify a subset of federal land strongholds that may be candidates for greater protection under 30 by 30 policy based on current land management conditions. So these are kind of focusing on those areas that are managed for priorities other than biodiversity conservation, and being able to kind of make suggestions based on various factors that go into the 30 by 30 framework, including species richness, which we have in blues. The darker the blue, the more species rich these federal lands are. And we also have a metric that's showing kind of the dependence of species on these federal lands, how much of their range falls into the federal lands estate. And I think there are quite a few that are wholly dependent on federal lands. And so that's represented in the pink. So where those two kind of overlap in this purple space, you have federal lands that are very species rich and also very important for some of these endangered species because they are very heavily dependent on them. So these are some recommendations, some of the analyses that'll go into helping us make recommendations for thinking about strengthening protections on these lands. However, of course, the current federal lands estate misses out on a lot of our biodiverse and carbon rich areas, as we showed, and may not represent many of the ecoregions in the US, like in the Northeast. So what might be some key things to consider in your neck of the woods? We've looked at, obviously, the kind of the overlap of these two major tenets of 30 by 30. We have, biodiversity, we have carbon rich areas. Where can we essentially feed two birds with one seed, right? Get the most bang for our buck in 30 by 30. There is quite a bit of overlap in these two major objectives. So biodiversity richness, if we take all of our very biodiverse areas, I think nearly 50% of them are also these very high carbon rich areas in the US. And that number, as you can see here, actually looks like it's probably higher than 50% in Maine. So very promising for thinking about where to protect and conserve areas. Unfortunately, again, those areas are very much underrepresented in our protected areas database here. So this map is looking at just those areas where we have the very high biodiversity and very high carbon rich areas, but just those that are protected in the protected areas database. So gap 1 and 2 there is in the yellow, is showing you those areas that are prioritized for biodiversity conservation and kind of meet those very two important tenets of 30 by 30. And then those purple areas are ones that are part of the protected areas network, but not prioritized for biodiversity conservation. Some of the other projects that we're undertaking are more forward thinking. So we also want to make sure that we're protecting areas that are going to be important to species in the future, given the threat of climate change. So we're analyzing climate refugia and climate corridors based on a number of different climate informed models. And these areas we hope will help species to adapt and migrate as necessary. There is some overlap with the current biodiversity hotspots, but mainly you can see that these areas are more complementary on the landscape. So really adding to the 30 by 30 picture. It's more and more clear that if we focus on biodiversity as it is today, then we'll, and setting protected areas based on that, then we'll be missing out on a lot of the places that are going to be needed in the future. And you can see that, New England is going to be one of those very important corridors, especially for those biodiverse areas in the South, in Appalachia, and helping species to migrate northward or stay in place and find refuge. So thinking about other pathways for Maine, the majority of those areas that are currently prioritized for multiple use are state-owned or actually fall into the other category, which is, I think, very unique relative to other states. However, we kind of showed that even if you converted all of these multiple use areas into those that are managed for biodiversity, Maine would still fall short of that 30% goal. Private lands conservation is going to be key in Maine, and thankfully the state is actually already leading the way in that. If not near the top, I think Maine may be the top state for conservation easements, with I think over 9% of the state falling in conservation easements, which is really promising. So here are some of those really important things to think about for the state of Maine. It's really wonderfully biodiverse and carbon rich. So you really have both of those pieces in play, which really makes it great to advocate for 30 by 30 in the state. It's certainly going to be important for climate adaptation. Our kind of national analysis so far is showing that there's a few main major corridors for really assisting in climate adaptation and migration for these species, and the Appalachian and New England one is one of them. Maine is top in conservation easements, so that's already kind of a great foundation in place. And so that may be one really key pathway for continuing to move toward the 30% target, if that's, because that is one of the things that, Maine is really interested in right now, which is wonderful. And most really, it's going to be more taking those pathways and thinking about private lands conservation and conservation easements, because of those multiple use areas are really won't get to near that 30% mark. But it is also interesting to know that they are state owned and owned by essentially the other category. So that might be a way to start to talk to your state representatives and your local state groups. We will continue to kind of work on these various projects and really get the science out there. We're using, our coalition building to work with other groups to identify and really fill gaps in the science here. And as 30 by 30 really comes to fruition, there will certainly be a need to continue to make the science and the data accessible in a way that planners and managers can utilize this information and make smarter strategic decisions about special land and species protections, particularly now with a change in administration to one that has placed the climate and biodiversity kind of at the fore, where there's a lot of excitement and a lot of thought toward, okay, what are going to be the next steps for implementation? And that's where we're kind of working with our teams. We're working also with our wonderful tech team at our center to come up with kind of tools like this one, which we used during the push of the 30 by 30 bill in the state of California to help folks view the data, interact with the data, explore the data, and be more thoughtful about these decisions in expanding our protected areas network. So with that, I just, again, like to say thank you. I'm so excited that that Maine is enthusiastic about 30 by 30 and is joining in with the enthusiasm of other states. And at this point, I'd love to take questions. Obviously, as we continue to see, sometimes these things bring more questions than answers, but that's only more exciting, I think.
Lindsay, if you could just stop the screen share. We're just going to pause quickly for our call to action of sorts, but I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen. And again, if you have questions, you can send them to Kathleen. That'd be great.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Lindsay. That was really fascinating. We already have a ton of good questions. If you're thinking of other things, just go ahead and send those to me through the chat, and I'll sort of collate them and group them together and do the asking. But first, our Lunch and Learn regulars know that this is the part of the program where we share a call to action, a way for each of us to get engaged in the day's topic. And we also know that achieving 30 by 30 will really require an ambitious and inclusive movement, and we have to get our local, state, national, tribal leaders, private landowners, everybody's part of the solution. So Governor Mills has already signaled her support by including 30 by 30 as a goal in the new climate action plan. And at MCV, we're really urging leaders in the state legislature and at the local level to add their names to that effort and help build the momentum. So earlier this week, we reached out to all state legislators and asked them to sign on to the 30 by 30 initiative. And we would love your support in encouraging them to sign on. So later this afternoon, we'll send a follow-up email with a link to a sign-on letter and ask that you share that with your local and state officials. I noticed this morning when I was checking that my state representative and state senator had not yet signed on, and I just sent them a little message of encouragement, and they've already done it. So it doesn't take much time. We really appreciate you adding your voice and getting them to add their voices. There is a deadline of Tuesday. So when you get that email, click right through, and then you can go about your weekend. But first, let's ask some questions. Lindsay, there were some folks who noticed discrepancies or differences in some of the data that you shared and the data that they're used to seeing. So just wondering about the calculations, and obviously how you started off by saying these numbers are not static, and we need to figure out where they're coming from. So we're looking at the same metrics as we measure progress. Here in Maine, we're, with that climate action plan, thinking about a number of about 20% as where we are now for conserved lands. And that includes conservation easements and outright purchases of land and combinations of public and private conservation. That bar graph that you showed looked a lot lower. What accounts for that difference? Do you know?
Yeah, I think that as it's probably just what we're referring to as conserved or protected. All of these things are, right? There has to be something that equates to that onto a map. So what we went with was purely the protected areas database. And you'll notice that some of my slides had that said GAP on it. So for that database, each land unit is given a GAP code, and that was essentially what we used to say was protected. So those that had a GAP code 1 or 2, and that is what was used in that calculation. I'm sure for those folks and groups that have a better, more intimate understanding of their states and landscapes and the what is actually happening on those lands, they can certainly modify that as appropriate. So there are certain limitations to having, a big national data set that's looking at thousands and thousands of land units and going based off of, certainly limited understanding. And there are certainly also other nuances to this data set too, and maybe designations that we don't necessarily always agree with, but obviously I don't have the knowledge of every land unit. So it's great that someone's gone through and maybe with a slightly different definition and certainly better knowledge of the Maine landscape determined that that number is higher.
Yeah, thank you, and totally understand that there are lots of different data sets here. What from your perspective, should multi-use areas count toward that 30%, or are we really looking for lands that are being specifically managed to protect biodiversity? Is there a difference there?
Yeah, I think that there are certainly, it's going to depend. And again, that's where, unfortunately, I don't have the time to go through every management plan of every land unit. But I think that there are certain activities on those multiple use lands that just may not be, may not mesh well with the species that are occurring there or need to be protected. So in those cases, it's always going to depend. There are very heavily extractive activities that may not be appropriate in terms of conserving biodiversity, and that's just where those priorities don't line up. But there may be others, and we've been exploring those where they are right now considered essentially multiple use, but those uses may be more mild, or maybe there's more opportunity there.
Yeah, and of course, even within a particular use, there's a huge range, because my next question was going to be, so does farmland count? But my guess is that kind of depends on what sort of farming we're talking about, right? Are you having conversations with farmers and ranchers and loggers and those folks who make their living on the land, as you think about what the impacts will be, or just understanding that?
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the things that we're exploring, and our teams who are working more with in private lands conservation, who are working with farm bill programs, working with NRCS, are very much interested in understanding those nuances, what their needs are, and really to come to a better understanding of this very I think weighted word, protect. It's a very tough thing to define or pinpoint in something by 30 by 30, which is why I think a lot of groups are kind of avoiding that challenge. But we're moving forward to kind of try and have those discussions with all different kinds of stakeholders, including people in private lands and working lands.
Thanks, and just thank you for your patience with trying to wrap our minds around this. Thinking about the land, I'm going to transition and ask about the ocean. When we talk about protecting the ocean, are we talking about marine reserves, which I think is probably a much smaller number than that 26% that you started out with? How do we know when an ocean area is protected or counting towards that 30 by 30 goal?
Yeah, and that's, I think, gets to be a stickier one. Certainly the Marine Protected Areas Network has kind of a similar set of those codes. And that is, initially just what we had to go by. But there's certainly room for exploring that more. And there are certainly a lot of different, I think, readings of the marine landscape depending on who you're talking to. But yes, I think that there's certainly you know, a different set of activities and things. And I know that there's been a lot of recent news surrounded around oceans, given a newer bill that was put out there. But yeah, in terms of what's protected for oceans, yeah, the marine protected areas network is the kind of the data set that we were focused on, and that could be, you know, a wide range of things. And it's a similar situation of, you know, protected for biodiversity versus multiple use, which yes, could be a wide range of activities.
So is that 26% of the ocean, is that in marine reserves or?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And let me think, the 26% one is generally, it could be federally, state, or I don't think there's much private or otherwise owned. When you start to read state bills, for, I'm sure, a reason that's more obvious to them rather than me, their numbers for, especially for marine, not terrestrial, seem to be focused on just the state managed marine reserves.
Great. And then just thinking about, you know, there are clearly different ways, different things that we're counting towards that 30%, but then there are also different places that we may be counting it. You talked about is the goal to reach 30% in each state and country and jurisdiction in the world, or is it a 30% overall? If we meet our goals, but other countries don't, or other countries do, tell us what success looks like.
Yeah, so it's actually, I think a lot of that question is going to be driven by policy. So yes, the goal is globally, and obviously the U.S. has kind of, you know, signed on in its own way, and taken a charge as you know, submission of proposals in the House and Senate on this. So that's a kind of a federal 30%, I guess, or a national 30%. And then there are states who have taken on this initiative too. So for example, California has an executive order to reach 30% for their state. So that will certainly contribute, and you kind of, you know, build its way up. But yeah, this was kind of just initial slice. We did it by states, knowing that I think going forward, we're going to be decision makers who are working at the state level and thinking about 30% or 30 by 30 for their states. But no, that is not certainly the requirement for 30 by 30, although, you know, it might be great. But I would say one of the tenets kind of as part of these proposals at the national scale is being able to represent all of our various ecosystems and ecoregions in that 30%, not necessarily 30% of each ecoregion or unit per se, but just to make sure that they are all represented in a protected areas network.
That makes sense. And those climate corridors that you talked about. And then we had a question from a participant about conservation in the Great Plains and thinking about, you know, tall grass prairie, which is one of the most eroded ecosystems, and short grass prairie. And as part of a really sad part of our history is that a lot of that biodiversity was lost before we started tracking, right? So what does it look like to restore an area like that we perhaps haven't seen in its full glory?
Yeah, it is. It is all of these always kind of analyses that we're doing, at least so far, it always ends up being a tough story for those prairies and the middle parts of our country, because of biodiversity, at least for the species that we actually have spatial data for, is lower, and because when you're talking about carbon, right, everyone's thinking of like the big carbon stores, the trees, the forest, and so a lot of the prairies kind of get left out in that story too. But in terms of being able to represent all of our ecoregions, represent all of our key groups of species like sage grouse, which are imperiled, and certainly many other species as well. That's where I think those we can continue to push to conserve and protect and restore those areas.
So acquiring land and managing it and restoring it is expensive. Have you all brought a financial analysis to this work? How do we actually get this done?
Yeah, that is another one of the pieces to this story that we're exploring. There are, really important or really great data that we've also acquired that we're kind of layering on top of the other parts of our layered onion here, that look at, essentially fair market values, costs to restore, and those various pieces, so that we can start to, paint that picture of not only just the benefits, obviously, but the costs too. Thankfully, there have been a number of other great reports out there supporting 30 by 30 that give more detail into what it would take to finance 30 by 30 and such, and I'm happy to share those, and all kind of come to the conclusion that the benefits do far outweigh the costs in every case, for land and sea, and everything in between. But yes, that is true in terms of, especially, in terms of land acquisition and private lands conservation and other, expansion of, anything you can think of that folks have put out there, expansion of our land trust network, expansion of our wildlife refuges, expansion of all of these really great systems. People are going to need to know what it's going to cost. And so that is kind of another one of those pieces that we'll layer onto these.
Thanks. And then it seems like there's identifying the areas that we want to preserve. There's acquiring the land so that we can begin that work. What does the actual restoration look like? Is it just a matter of, walking away and leaving it alone, or are there other things that we need to do?
Yeah, I think that's going to be another one of those it depends questions. It depends on what you're trying to conserve. And it depends on, what the goal is going to be for that landscape. What are the needs of the species? If multiple use is deemed fine for that area, how I'm sure that it won't just be walking away. It may be a mix of just different kinds of uses. Could certainly still be recreation. It may be that it's one of those places that are going to be key access for our underrepresented communities. So I think that's certainly gonna still be a mix. But yeah, and it may be that there needs to be a little bit more active restoration in the cases of things like invasive species and that sort of thing, which are, you know, even more things that we're trying to consider moving forward, is that there are still many kind of threats to wildlife and the environment that aren't necessarily included in 30 by 30 and may need to be considered in those restoration pieces.
To bring it back to this moment in time, I know many of us have found the last 10 months or so, nature has been a real refuge. And I think a lot of us have had a new sort of awakening, even amongst the conservation community, about how important it is to have public access to public lands. And at the same time, a lot of our land trusts and conservancies and preserves are facing some real financial challenges. How do we sort of build on this newfound commitment and start to address some of the, you know, use this moment as a chance to do better and build momentum?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so great about this, is that this has been gaining steam and continuing to gain steam for quite some time. And yeah, I think momentum is going to be key. I think that one of the great things about this is that you know, for the longest time, this has obviously been, or longer time, not longest, it's obviously been familiar more to those of us in the conservation community. And it really is only until now, and maybe very likely in the coming months, 3 months, that more and more people will be hearing about it. I can tell you from personal experience that there's more and more certainly media interest in this. There's certainly more and more interest from our representatives on this and the incoming leadership. And so I think that, you know, continuing to keep this going, having a plan for moving forward, and that's really what a lot of our work is about, is thinking about the next steps, thinking about making sure that we can operationalize and implement these things to keep that moving. And of course, you know, as usual, to keep pushing our leadership and our representatives to take notice.
Well, thank you so much for that work, and we'll all follow along with defenders and other organizations to keep our fingers on the pulse of the 30 by 30 initiative and do whatever we can to move that work forward. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to everybody on the line for being part of our first Lunch and Learn of the year. We will be back in this space next week with one of our, a repeat speaker. Lost the word there for a second. Dr. Kate McMahon, who is with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, did a really fantastic presentation back in 2020, and she will join us again next week to talk about rural African American communities, particularly the town of Peterborough in Warren, Maine. Right around the corner from where I live. I knew nothing about it and can't wait to hear the story of Amos and Sarah Peters, a Revolutionary War veteran and freedom petitioner, respectfully, who built their large community in Warren and fought for freedom and the futures of their descendants. So thank you for joining us today. I hope you will join us again next week. Till then, have a wonderful weekend, and glad to have you with us today.